Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society for the 37th James Russell Wiggins Lecture in the History of the Book in American Culture. We're here in Worcester in Antiquarian Hall with a robust audience watching tonight on YouTube. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain a vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Bibliographical Society of America. We're grateful for their support. We're also delighted to have in our audience here tonight the participants in our summer seminar on sex, gender, and print. This seminar, as well as the Wiggins Lecture, are both part of the American Antiquarian Society's program in the history of the book in American culture. My name is Scott Casper. I'm the president of the American Antiquarian Society, and it's my honor to say a few words about our program in the history of the book and the Wiggins Lecture. Then I'll turn this over to my colleague, John Garcia, to introduce tonight's speaker. AAS's program in the history of the book in American culture has been a leader in this field of inquiry since the early 1980s. Over more than 40 years, the program has sponsored annual summer seminars on varied topics, lectures and book talks, conferences and symposia, as well as the 5-volume A History of the Book in America, published between 1999 and 2010. The James Russell Wiggins Lecture has long been a highlight of this program. Over the decades, Wiggins lectures have featured leaders in the fields of book history and print culture, speaking about both interpretive and methodological issues. Previous Wiggins lectures, don't worry, I won't name all 36, have included David Hall, who was the first in 1983, Bob Gross, Mary Kelly, Carla Peterson, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Michael Winship, Patricia Crane, Richard Yarborough, and last year, Joe Razek. The lecture honors James Russell Wiggins, affectionately known to his friends as Russ, a nearly lifelong newspaper editor, beginning with his high school paper, The Echo, in Luverne, Minnesota, and taking him from his hometown Rock County Star to the St. Paul Dispatch and eventually the Washington Post, where he served as editor from 1947 to 1968. After brief service as the United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations, he moved with his wife, Mabel, to Brooklyn, Maine, where he had purchased the local newspaper, the local weekly newspaper, the Ellsworth American. In what turned out to be not quite his retirement, he spent the next 3 decades editing the paper, raising its circulation from 3,000 to 11,000, and writing all of its editorials himself and contributing weekly verses even after he sold the paper in 1991. Russ Wiggins served the American Antiquarian Society as its vice president and president, the equivalent of vice chair and chair of our board, from 1969 to 1977. During those momentous years, AAS began its fellowship programs, received its first support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and instituted computerized cataloging of acquisitions. Wiggins understood that AAS existed then, as it does now, within a larger cultural and educational ecosystem. In a 1977 talk that was reprinted in the AAS proceedings, Russ Wiggins wrote this, and the talk was called Charting Cultural Priorities. He was reflecting on the challenges of what he called rising needs and diminishing resources, a story that may sound familiar to us today, nearly half a century later. Wiggins ended that lecture with a call to action, which I would say is a call to action for all of us. And I quote, "It is the task of those who operate and support these institutions to see to it that the cultural priorities of the future are fixed by the broadest understanding and appreciation of the importance of agencies of learning in the world that is coming into being." Public programs like tonight's and like the ones that AAS hosts all year long aim to enhance that broader understanding of why learning matters and why history and the original sources matter. In recognition of his contributions to the society and his lifelong commitment to freedom of the press, his friends established the endowment to create the James Russell Wiggins Lecture, and tonight, as I mentioned, marks the 37th such event here at AAS. I'm pleased now to introduce my colleague, John Garcia, Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships at AAS. He directs the program in the history of the book in American culture. John joined AAS in 2023, but he wasn't new to AAS then. He had worked in academia and the book trade. He himself has done research in the history of the book here at AAS as a fellow on several occasions. And I'm delighted that John will come up and introduce tonight's Wiggins lecturer.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, everybody. Thanks, Scott. I would also like to thank the Bibliographical Society of America for once again co-sponsoring tonight's Wiggins lecture. And also want to give a shout out to the FIBEC seminar this year. It's really been an amazing 3 days, and I know the rest of the week is going to be just as good. Thanks, no doubt, to the instructors, Jordan Stein and Greta LaFleur. So far, there's been lots of conversation and lots of looking at things, which we like to do in the seminars. We looked at things such as racy newspapers, satirical prints, waste sheets that were marbled over from a lost edition of Fanny Hill, and much, much more. And Scott mentioned the way that AAS programs support research, but I think the seminars are a good example of how AAS also supports community. And it's an opportunity for people to gather and talk and make connections that could last for many years. Now it's my great pleasure, though, to turn things over, to turn our attention to tonight's speaker. Christopher Looby is professor of English at the University of California, Los Angeles. He received his PhD from Columbia University, and prior to UCLA, taught also at the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania. And he's taught at UCLA for over 20 years. His contributions to scholarship, teaching, and the profession are legendary. At UCLA, he established the Americanist Research Colloquium, which is a works in progress workshop that gathers scholars from across Southern California to talk about works in progress and to meet each other and make new connections. And from my own personal experience, I think it's a great example of how generous Chris is. He invited me to join that colloquium when I was teaching in California. So it's just a great program. He also, people will know him. There's really too many things to list here, but he's also the founding president of C19, the Society of 19th Century Americanists. And that is a community that has many overlaps with AAS, from fellows and researchers, and also staff as well who participate in C19 in various capacities. Chris's scholarship is immense. There's no way to capture it all here. He is the author of Voicing America, Language, Literary Form, and the Origins of the United States, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. And interestingly, over the years, he's also turned his attention to scholarly editing, starting with the publication in 2000 of the Journals of Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Then, in 2008, he helped transform our understanding of 19th century American literature by republishing Robert Montgomery Bird's 1836 novel, Shepherd Lee. Now, over the years, Chris's writing and editing have increasingly turned their attention to the history of sexuality, particularly with a series that he edits for the University of Pennsylvania Press called Q19, the Queer American 19th Century, which returns and reframes important queer literary texts to print. It's now up to 4 volumes and includes the republication of Thomas Winthrop's novel, Cecil Dream from 1861, another collection called The Man Who Thought Himself a Woman and Other Queer 19th Century Short Stories, which was discussed in the seminar just on Monday, and also Margaret Sweat's 1859 novel, Esther's Love Life. Now, many of the FIBAC participants cited a 2013 article by Chris Looby called The Literariness of Sexuality when they applied to the seminar. And because of that, we thought it made perfect sense for Chris Looby to give this year's Wiggins lecture. So I'm excited now to turn things over to Chris.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I want to thank Scott for his introduction and also for his stewardship of the American Antiquarian Society, and thank John Garcia for the very welcome invitation to deliver this year's Wiggins lecture. And I also want to thank Lauren Havelis and other folks here at the Antiquarian Society whose names I probably don't know, but who no doubt had something to do with making the arrangements for me to come here. It's also a very distinct pleasure, as you've just heard, to have my lecture coordinated with the week-long seminar that Jordan Stein and Gretel Lafleur are running and that many people in this room are participating in. And also, just to go back a little bit to something Scott said in his introduction, it's a really delightful fact that I'm following the two immediately previous Wiggins lecturers, Joseph Resnick in 2024 and Richard Yarbrough in 2023. Joe Resnick, as you know, now teaches at Boston University, but he got his PhD at UCLA. And Richard Yarbrough is my, sadly, just recently retired colleague at UCLA. So it's been a good little 3-year streak for UCLA. And if you want suggestions for who could do it next year and keep this going, that would be great. Go Bruins. Let's see. Let me get started. As John mentioned in his warm introduction, I'm hitting the thing by mistake. This is going to take a little coordination, so bear with me. As John mentioned in his warm introduction, one of my ongoing projects is a series of reprint editions for the University of Pennsylvania Press under the title Q19, The Queer American 19th Century. Although my investigation of Jonathan Edwards and the bad books controversy isn't part of that ongoing project, it's sort of adjacent to it, so to speak, because it also aims to reach back beyond the point in time when many historians of sexuality would locate the emergence of a distinctly sexualized subjectivity and retrieve earlier anticipations or pre-formations or partial formations of something like what would later come to be called sexuality. My talk today is going to claim eventually that in the textual record of the bad books controversy, we might be able to detect very early intimations of modern sexuality as the corollary of what Michel Foucault famously called scientia sexualis, a knowledge of the truth of our sex. I'll proceed today first to describe in broad contours an episode in Edwards's career that has come to be called the bad books controversy. Along the way, I'll describe and credit several of the important scholarly articles that over a quite long stretch of time have very gradually brought the fundamental facts and issues of this controversy into focus. Most of the scholarship on this episode thus far has been frankly biographical and historical, seeking to narrate and explain the events of the controversy, and that's all fair enough. But these investigations have so far not been extensively and explicitly engaged with the history of sexuality. So my general goal is to see if this controversy can be made to yield some insight for the historical field of sexuality studies. And I should say at the outset that the case presents considerable archival challenges, mainly because virtually everything we know about it comes from some brief and elliptical manuscript notes in Edwards's hand. One set of notes he jotted down while taking testimony about the young men's alleged offenses, their illicit possession and use of several medical or pseudo-medical texts, and another set of notes that seemed to be his articulation of a defense after some members of his congregation began questioning the propriety of his having accused the young men publicly of these misdeeds. So the documentary sources are all from Edwards's hand and are colored by his stake in defending himself and his actions. Eventually, I want to make several claims that are at the very least inferential and maybe even somewhat speculative that we can detect in this controversy a version of the coalescence of a concept of sexuality, one that is not usually thought of as existing at this early date. Throughout, as you'll see, I'll be relying on a distinction made most crisply, in my view, by the philosopher Arnold Davidson in an essay entitled Sex and the Emergence of Sexuality, a distinction he makes between an older style of reasoning, as he calls it, in which persons' bodies are susceptible to outside stimuli and are therefore sometimes lured into moral errors, and a later style of reasoning, which he, Davidson, associates with the advent of the disciplines of psychology and psychiatry in the late 19th century. And in fact, Davidson calls it the psychiatric style of reasoning. I trust this is a familiar distinction to you, and of course it derives from Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality. But while I don't doubt that psychiatry played a consequential role in the consolidation of modern sexuality, I also think it didn't emerge out of nowhere, didn't emerge ex nihilo. It had to be built upon foundations that preceded it. And that's what I'm on the hunt for. Okay, so here's the story. Early in the year 1744, Edwards learned that a number of the young men of his congregation had been circulating several allegedly obscene books among themselves. They turned out to be the old and much reprinted sex manual known as Aristotle's Masterpiece, and we saw a lot of different editions of that here in the room earlier today. So if you want to come back to the AAS and look at them, they're here. It was first published in 1684, and I think that is the 1684 version. And then it went through hundreds of subsequent editions. And then a newer midwifery manual called The Midwife Rightly Instructed by one Thomas Dawkes, surgeon, from 1736. And thus began an incident in Edwards's career that's often credited by historians as a turning point on the way to his congregation's eventual dismissal of him as their pastor. Although the text by Dawkes is quite interesting, among other things that I find quite attractive and interesting about it is it takes the literary form of a dialogue between a physician and a young woman he is training to be a midwife. I was describing this to someone the other day. He makes the claim that women make much better midwives than men. And so it has I don't want to call it a proto-feminist dimension, but he honors the fact that women are better midwives than men. On the other hand, they need to be taught by a male surgeon to know what they're doing. But anyway, I'll concentrate more on Aristotle's Masterpiece today as the text that operated in this affair more centrally. There's an interesting scholarly history, as I said earlier, that has very slowly uncovered many of the dimensions of this controversy. And I want to mention just now that a former graduate student at UCLA named Emily Fenster, who did a project under my supervision some years ago, she hypothesized in a paper she wrote that there was very likely a third text circulating among the young men in Northampton, because Edwards's notes record one witness, Rebecca Strong, testifying that the book she witnessed the young men poring over had, quote, pictures that seemed to her to be these parts of a woman's body. And another witness, Rachel Clapp, referred to, quote, what was pictured out in the book. There the child is, lies all pictured out. Now, most of the early editions of Aristotle's Masterpiece have one version or another of a frontispiece, which you just saw, with a hairy woman and a black child, but no illustrations that would seem to answer to the description parts of a woman's body. What Emily did not discover, even though she looked at all the copies of Aristotle she could get her hands on, is something that the great historian of Aristotle's Masterpiece, Mary Fissel, pointed out in one of her essential essays on this topic, but an essay of hers that's less accessible than others because it's not digitized. But what she pointed out was the various pseudo-Aristotle texts circulating before 1744. Only one had an image that would have been described as parts of a woman's body. And in fact, we saw this, an edition with this fold-out folding leaf plate of the form of a child in the womb, and you can see at the top the woman's breasts are visible, and toward the bottom her external genitalia are visible. So Mary Fissel thinks this is probably what these two female witnesses were citing, but I'm still a little bit undecided about whether this exactly corresponds to their description. So it's possible that there were more than one edition of Aristotle's masterpiece circulating in Northampton at the time, or it's possible that there's yet a third text that hasn't been identified. Okay. The first important progress in deciphering this controversy came in 1932 when Thomas Johnson published an article in the New England Quarterly under the title Jonathan Edwards and the Young Folks' Bible, and I know many of you in the room have just read that. Previously, scholars had believed that the controversy must have been about a novel or about novels, but Johnson noted that Edwards was in fact not entirely disapproving of novels, so that was unlikely. Furthermore, Johnson examined and studied the manuscript notes that I mentioned earlier and argued, quote, actual evidence as to the truth of the matter has always lain in the Edwards manuscripts, but no one has ever yet taken the trouble to get at it. Johnson discovered there that the book in question was, quote, about womankind, about women's having children. Johnson also very generously quoted from those then less accessible manuscripts and saw there that in one of them Edwards had noted, quote, Medad Lyman wanted Aristotle. I love these Puritan names, Medad Lyman. Elsewhere, Edwards noted that, quote, John Langton boasted that he had read Aristotle. Elsewhere, another witness said, quote, the title, The Midwife Rightly Instructed, a New Book, and Midwife Rightly Instructed. Johnson concluded, the testimony makes clear that the reading had been going on for some time, that it was from a volume on midwifery put to pornographic uses. I'm going to come back to that term in a moment. And that it was from some work of Aristotle, which is spoken of as a granny book. Quite evidently, the book was the works of the pseudonymous Aristotle, variously known as Secret of Secrets, Last Legacy, Masterpiece, Complete Midwife, or Problems of Aristotle. Johnson at the time could find no record of a book with the title The Midwife Rightly Instructed, but he did peg the references to Aristotle as certainly one or another, or maybe several, of the vastly popular and much reprinted pseudo-Aristotelian sex manuals. And he got the basic outlines of the events right. Johnson corrected an error. The book was not Pamela or any other novel. He established the basic outlines of the Bad Book affair. In 1744, a number of young men were discovered to have been illicitly reading a midwifery manual or some other text for indecent purposes. They were talking about it among themselves, and they were teasing and harassing girls and young women based on their acquired knowledge of female sexual anatomy, menstruation, sex, reproduction, etc. Edwards got wind of this and began a public inquiry. And some of the young men who were accused compounded their offenses by behaving extremely disrespectfully toward the inquiring committee. So that was really the first breakthrough in understanding this episode. Further progress toward understanding these events waited a long time till 2002 when Ava Chamberlain published an important essay also in the New England Quarterly entitled Bad Books and Bad Boys, with the subtitle The Transformation of Gender in 18th Century Northampton, Massachusetts. Chamberlain revisited the Bad Books affair and solved a few more scholarly mysteries. She also offered a very subtle account of the historical circumstances of the case, the moment of strong historical transition to enrich our understanding of what was at stake in the Bad Books affair. Why did it erupt into such a controversy? Why did it apparently start a process that eroded Edwards's authority with his church and finally led to his dismissal from the pulpit in 1750? The Bad Books affair, Chamberlain wrote, quote, was primarily about sex, sex and speech, reading and talking about sex. That strikes me actually as a very apt description. She also quite helpfully re-described the whole controversy as having proceeded in two temporal phases. Events relating to the Bad Book episode fall into two distinct phases, she wrote. In the first, that is the first phase, a group of Northampton's adolescent boys secretly circulated among themselves a number of popular medical texts containing detailed descriptions of the structure and function of women's reproductive anatomy. The boys then used their newly acquired knowledge to taunt and ridicule adolescent girls. So just an aside here, one of the curious things, I stipulate that I admire this article greatly. But even though within the article, she specifies that all of these young men were in their 20s and some of them were in their upper 20s, she still continues to refer to them as boys and adolescents, even in the title, Bad Boys and Bad Books. So I think that's one of the things that's a little bit dated and a little bit off about this very, very excellent, otherwise very excellent article. I want merely to note here that they were all in their 20s, and one of them at least was married. Most of them were not. The case entered its second phase when a number of the brethren who had initially supported the action changed their minds. As the committee met to obtain testimony, the accused compounded their offense by speaking contemptuously of the committee's members and playing childish games during its proceedings. Now recall that Thomas Johnson, am I on the right slide? Yes. Recall, if you will, that Thomas Johnson wrote that the young men were putting the book in question, he thought it was one book, to pornographic uses. He's not explicit about what he means by pornographic, although it seems likely that he's discreetly, because it's 1932 in the New England Quarterly, actually he quotes from a part of the notes that Edwards took where one of the young men refers to the people sitting on the inquiry board as turds and farts. But in the New England Quarterly in 1932, those are, T, line, D, and so forth. It's kind of charming. So maybe he's discreetly hinting at masturbation. One might speculate that the young men were not only talking about the books and taunting girls with information gleaned from them, but might have been masturbating with them too. But to my mind, one of the striking things about the Bad Books controversy is the fact that this doesn't seem to have ever explicitly been a part of the Bad Books affair. I owe a debt to Greta LaFleur here, who gave a very provocative and indeed quite cheeky talk at the last C19 conference with the enchanting title, quote, I hope you don't mind my saying this, on the use and self-abuse of literature for life, or 19th century spank banks, in which she made the very reasonable assumption that the young men were using these books for purposes of autoeroticism. And I was fortunate that I heard the talk at the time, and it was around the time I was teaching the Bad Books controversy in a class. And I wrote to Greta afterwards and shared the information that my students had noted that, to their surprise, no hint of masturbation appears in Edwards's notes about the episode. So I'm puzzling about this still and can think of two possible reasons for this absence. It might be that Edwards suspected or knew that the young men were using the books for masturbation, but that this was not something that he could decently discuss publicly in 1744 in Northampton. So he had to let that part of it go. Another possibility is that he suspected or knew that the accused were using the book for masturbation, but as this was presumably private behavior, he may have addressed it privately with the accused. What he could discuss in public were the public dimensions of these events. The young men often did their collective reading and talking in the presence of women. They confronted and harassed women in public, in private homes, but also on the streets. And the whole series of events had become public knowledge. That was the essence of his justification for instituting a public inquiry. Chamberlain writes, Northampton's adolescent boys treated Aristotle's masterpiece and the midwife rightly instructed not as medical texts, but as pornography. She goes on, in this context, reading became flirting, even incipient foreplay. But I don't think these are the right terms at all. I've mentioned that I admire this essay and find a lot of value in it, but it's also dated in additional ways, not just that she keeps referring to them as boys. The young men, as depicted in Edwards's notes, don't seem to me to have been flirting, much less engaging in incipient foreplay, whatever incipient foreplay might mean. They were harassing and intimidating the young women, and in several instances, they laid hands on them in an aggressive fashion. So there would be a different way to frame their actions today. But much of Chamberlain's analysis is persuasive. She outlines, as I mentioned, several historical transitions. There's an ongoing transition in gender relations. Earlier Puritans had required sexual chastity of both men and women and had punished sexual infractions equally. But that was changing. Quote, the general understanding that the sexes were spiritually equal was being replaced by a conviction of their difference. Men were coming to be understood as sexually driven in a way that women were not, and thus not always capable of self-restraint. More and more, the onus was on women to preserve their chastity, while male sexual misbehavior was more and more frequently downplayed, if not even winked at. Another historical transition Chamberlain usefully outlines had to do with the private-public demarcation. Quote, the controversy focused on the distinction between public and private offense. Earlier, Puritan society had considered all behavior as subject to inspection and correction by the church, but this was changing too. More and more, a zone of privacy was being claimed. Some matters, including sexual behavior, were coming to be considered private. Some church members evidently changed their minds while all this was going on and said that Edwards should have dealt with this matter privately. The historical gender transition and the historical public-private transition were, of course, intimately related to one another. The emerging private sphere was increasingly feminized. The public sphere was increasingly masculinized. I quote again from Chamberlain, Edwards struggled to preserve within his congregation the gender relations that characterized the pre-modern worldview of Puritan New England, but his position was rapidly losing support in the broader society. Edwards, quote, made himself obnoxious by rejecting the new laissez-faire approach to male sexual ethics and waging an extended campaign premised on the belief that men should be held publicly accountable for behaviors increasingly considered matters of private morality. All right, that's my outline founded on the great work of Thomas Johnson and Ava Chamberlain of the contours of the episode as a whole. I want to turn now very briefly to the conceptual language that appears both in Edwards's notes and in the pseudo-Aristotelian text. Because to repeat something I said earlier, I think that most of the scholarship on this thus far has come from historians and from biographers, and they have not done the kind of close reading of Edwards's notes or of Aristotle's masterpiece that literary scholars like myself might want to do. So I'm just going to riff here a little bit on some of the language that Edwards uses in his notes. So the Bad Book's Papers, that's the title I've given to the notes that he took while he was taking down testimony. So he uses phrases like exceeding unclean. Sometimes these phrases are from him, sometimes they're phrases he's presumably recording from witnesses. Exceeding unclean to the top of baseness. Nasty creatures, nasty book. Unclean, uncleanly, and lasciviously. And then from the Bad Book's transcripts, lascivious and obscene, unclean, exceeding unclean and bawdy to the highest degree. A base book, nasty book. Foul expressions, filthy. A lot of the vocabulary here, as you've seen, has to do with hygiene. Unclean, nasty, base, foul, and filthy. Matters pertaining to the lower bodily stratum, earthly, dirty. Some of the language arguably has to do with what we might now think of as sexuality. Words like lascivious, obscene, and bawdy. In the Bad Book's transcripts, he writes, and I'll come back to this also, "'Tis uncovering and viewing women's nakedness, for they do it in their imagination, do it in their hearts." But the thing that's really striking to me about this is that very little of the vocabulary that Edwards uses in his own notes has to do with sin. He never quite frames it, or very infrequently frames it, in terms of sin or religious categories. Sometimes in the notes where he's preparing his defense, he will have little parenthetical scriptural citations. So he was clearly relying on authority that he thought he was deriving from the Bible. But the only explicit place in his own transcripts is that last where he uses religious languages. He says, "They have put no difference between the holy and profane." And there's an example. He cites Ezekiel 22:26. So I don't know about you, but that strikes me as unexpected, that he would be framing this so infrequently and so minimally in religious terms. Okay, so Aristotle's masterpiece. Examples of the vocabulary of what we might call sexuality in this book. Desire is actually a word that's used a lot. Lust, of course. Propension and inclination of maids to marriage. Venery, very often venereal appetite, venereal pleasure. Lusty, enjoyment. Appetite, lascivious again. So there's some overlap between the characteristic language of Edwards's notes and the language of this book. And I want to come back to that too. Lewd, pleasure, one of my favorites, titulation and desire, delectation, and allurements to venery. Allurements to venery is an interesting phrase to me because if you'll think back to the distinction I was borrowing from Arnold Davidson, the distinction between the body having susceptibilities that some external stimulus could arouse versus the person having a kind of indwelling principle of desire that then goes and seeks its object or seeks its gratification. Allurements to venery seems to fall on one side of that distinction, and maybe venereal appetite falls on the other side of that distinction. So my provisional observations about Aristotle's masterpiece is that its general concept of sex involves venery, which is an indwelling instinct or appetite, but that this appetite has to be aroused by external stimulation, by allurements in the object. Appetite is then satisfied mechanically by copulation. So if we think of this as a really early installment in the history of what much later became the science of sexology, it's notable to me what's missing. There's very little conception of the normal-abnormal distinction, which is so central to 19th century sexology, except as involving excess or insufficiency. There's very little conception of the behavior-subjectivity distinction, which would be important for later sexological science. There's no taxonomy of variations. Those of you who've read 19th century sexology know that's a big part of that project, is to taxonomize all kinds of different variations of perversions. There's little conception of an interiorized sexual subjectivity. So I would say that overall, Aristotle's masterpiece recognizes sex, but does not or only very incipiently recognize something like sexuality. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, 19th century ideas of sexuality don't come out of nowhere. They have to be built upon some prior conceptual foundation. So I'm trying to think of Aristotle's masterpiece as providing some of the elements of such a foundation. Indecency of copulation is an elemental form of the abnormal, perhaps. For Aristotle, for pseudo-Aristotle, that usually means woman on top. Not too often or not too seldom. So frequency is maybe an elemental building block of the idea of the abnormal. Excess and deficiency. But in this book, these binaries, decent, indecent, excess, deficiency, too often, too seldom, they all operate within a frame of heterosexual, what we would call heterosexual and reproductive expectations. And they all appear to me, for the most part, to be subordinate to a conceptual model of appetite, arousal, satisfaction, rather than any sense of human persons possessing a specific sexuality. Okay, so that's the end of my brief interlude, and I'm happy to come back to that. And I'd love to know, since I know some of you here have been reading Aristotle's masterpiece, whether you think this is a correct account of it. But in the time that I have remaining, I'd like to draw your attention to two important aspects or dimensions of the bad book's controversy that have not, as far as I know, yet been fully recognized and analyzed. The first is the role of the discourse of imagination in this episode. The second is the place of the discourse of knowledge or knowing in this controversy. In the set of Edwards's notes that appear to be his articulation of a defense of his action, his decision to make the accusations public, he writes this, I've already quoted it, "'Tis uncovering and viewing women's nakedness, for they do it in their imagination, do it in their hearts." There are several reasons why I find this note interesting. For one thing, there's at least a hint here of an incipient idea of sexuality as an indwelling phenomenon, a predisposition, a propensity that resides within the individual prior to any external stimulation or any physical act. He attributes to the young men an imaginative act, a fantasy, if you will, that's generated from within their imaginations and precedes any external expression. The second reason I find this intriguing is that imagination has a truly outsized role in the conceptual apparatus of Aristotle's masterpiece. And I'll give you a number of examples. Very early on in the manual, in chapter 1, in fact, when discussing, quote, the reason that prompts virgins and youths to desire copulation, the author writes, the propension and inclination of maids to marriage is to be discovered by many symptoms, as when nature fringes the obscure parts, i.e. pubic hair, and their terms flow at the time appointed, menstruation, which is usually in the 14th or 15th year of their age, and the blood, which is no longer taken to augment their bodies, incites their minds and imaginations to venery. In the next chapter, when he's discussing, among other things, quote, the season fittest for copulation and the mechanics of male sexual arousal, the author mentions, quote, the appetite and desire to copulation, which fires the imagination with unusual fancies, or by the sight and feeling of a brisk, charming beauty. That's an interesting equivocation there, where on the one hand, their imaginations are generating this desire. On the other hand, it might be the sight of a brisk, charming beauty that's arousing them. You can see right there the unrationalized coexistence of two different models of erotic desire. Shortly thereafter, discussing the season fittest for copulation, Pseudo-Aristotle writes, quote, when therefore the terms are finished and the womb well cleansed, they must proceed decently, so you can't fuck too soon after you've menstruated, and not over rashly, though courage and activity must not be wanting, nor the force of imagination. It must not be wanting. A bit later on still, when outlining why children happen to resemble their parents physically, quote, and what the mother's imagination contributes thereto, some of you I can tell know what's coming, the author claims categorically, quote, nothing is more powerful than the imagination of the mother, for if she conceive in her mind or do by chance fasten her eyes upon any object and imprint it in her memory, the child in its outward parts frequently has some representation thereof. This is a dangerous imaginative capacity for women to have, because if a woman engages in unlawful copulation, that is, adultery, if she will only fix her mind on a vision of her husband while having sex with a different man, the child will turn out to resemble her lawful husband instead of her paramour. The author goes on and on about this. He seems quite enchanted by this possibility. Yes, next slide. Whilst another man was mounted in his saddle, that is the husband's saddle, she, fearing that he, her husband, would come and detect her in the act, had her imagination so fixed on him that as she conceived, the similitude could proceed, the resemblance of the child to her husband, from no other cause than her imagination. Wherefore it is apparent that likeness can confirm no child to be a lawful father's own. Among the many things that I find interesting about that sentence is the double duty that the word conceived is doing there. She's actually conceiving a child, and the child is going to resemble her husband because she has conceived his image. And adding to the humor associated with this imaginative power of women, pseudo-Aristotle adds, many women there are that seeing a hair cross them when great with child will, through the strength of imagination, bring forth a child with a hairy lip. In this case, the woman is already pregnant, but still her powerful imagination can configure her gestating child with physical features derived from something she had seen or imagined. Now, it won't surprise you at all that Aristotle's masterpiece is throughout concerned with so-called monstrous births or physical deformities. Quote, now a monstrous habit or shape of body is contracted diverse ways, as from fear, sudden frights, extraordinary passion, the influence of the stars, too much or too little seed, there's that excess, lack, the influence of the stars, too much or too little seed, the mother's strange imaginations, and diverse phantasms which the mind conceived to form the body and render the children of an improper shape, and many times not perfect in either sex. The power of the woman's imagination is incredibly considerable. The author writes, women can even conceive without the help of a man, by force of imagination, in those that are extremely lascivious, for that by seeing and touching their husbands at the same time strongly fancying themselves in the act, there again you can see the unreconciled coexistence of different styles of reasoning about sex and sexuality. On the one hand, the woman is actually seeing and touching her husband who's physically present. On the other hand, it's only her imagination of the act of sexual intercourse that is the effective cause of her conception of a child. There are plenty of other examples of the causational role of imagination in the book, but I think maybe those are enough for now. The point I want to make about this, recall Edwards's observation that, quote, they do it in their imagination, they do it in their hearts, is that I suspect Edwards himself read Aristotle's masterpiece and absorbed something of its emphasis on the consequential role of imagination in sexual fantasy and sexual practice. Now, someone at lunch today told me that they had read in one of the articles that's on your syllabus that there's some other evidence that Edwards actually possessed this book. If that evidence is out there, please, whoever that knows it, let me know. I mean, I would love it if I had inferred this from the internal evidence of his note-taking, and then if there's external evidence of it, that would be icing on the cake. Okay. Edwards may, as part of his diligent investigation of the young men's misconduct, have felt obliged to inspect the books they were alleged to be borrowing their information from. He may well have already been familiar with Aristotle's masterpiece, for although it's been framed by historians as a bad book, it was in fact a perfectly respectable text if read in the proper way and by legitimate readers, in spite of what might look to us like a certain amount of nonsense within it. The late Sarashutzi memorably called it, in a brisk essay in Commonplace, quote, Early America's Guide to Sex, and the historian Vern Bulla referred to it, quote, as an early American sex manual. And if it is the case, as I've claimed today, that Aristotle's masterpiece within itself does a good bit of the conceptual work of toggling between an older style of reasoning about sex, arousal depends upon an external object or stimulus that acts upon a latent susceptibility in the person, and an emergent, newer style of reasoning, persons have sexual subjectivities that propel them in search of objects or stimuli, then it would make sense that Edwards himself, as a probable reader of the text, would have been participating in that transition too. And that conceivably, even the young men who were reading the book, however ostensibly illegitimate and obviously crass their use of it, they might really have absorbed something from it and thus be participating in that transition as well. So I know that's speculative and inferential, but I'm trying to get there. The second and last understudied aspect of this controversy that I'd like to highlight is the way a discourse of knowledge operates during the episode. One thing that has not been remarked upon at all, as far as I'm aware, is that in Edwards's notes on the testimonies he heard about these events, he records that one of the culprits, Ebenezer Bartlett, was reported by a witness named Experience Strong to have said, quote, "It might be necessary for young men to know such things." That strikes me as an incredible statement. Very interesting that one of the accused young men should have made a positive claim for the legitimacy of young men's access to sexual knowledge, and that Edwards should have noted this, but then had nothing to say about it. In fact, throughout Edwards's notes on the testimonies in the case, many of the young men make claims to knowledge, albeit usually not Ebenezer Bartlett's striking claim for a legitimate need for sexual knowledge, but rather they do it in the context of their harassment and intimidation of girls and young women. For example, another witness, Rebecca Strong, testified that one or another of a group of young men, including Timothy and Simeon Root and Moses Sheldon, who were, quote, talking in a private way about a book, turned to her, the witness, presumably when they noticed that she was watching them, and said, quote, "You had not need to be scared. We know as much about ye as you, and more too." Another female witness, Mindwell Miller, there's another one of those great names, testified that she heard the same Moses Sheldon say, "I know a great deal more than you can think about the works of nature," then turned away and laughed. Yet another witness, Mary Downing, alleged that in her hearing, Oliver Warner was the ringleader in all this. He's one of the few who got convicted. She alleged that in her hearing, Oliver Warner and one or two more young men, quote, was reading amongst them in a book, and that what they laughed and made sport of was about girls, things concerning girls that it is unclean to speak of. They seemed to boast as if they knew about girls, knew what belonged to girls as well as girls themselves. They seemed, by their talk, to apprehend that they got what they knew about girls out of that book. They run upon the girls at that time, boasting how much they knew about them. Many other times here, talking in the same manner about what he knew about girls. He has talked to me himself about what he knew. There's something to me really striking about the insistence of the verb know and knew in all of this. Now, believe me, I don't have any desire to dignify these young men's boasting claims to knowledge. They seem to me that they were quite a bunch of young punks. But I think it's noteworthy that they persistently frame their harassment and intimidation of the young women as a matter of secular knowledge, of what Foucault called a scientia sexualis, derived from their reading, rather than an ars erotica. And Ebenezer Bartlett's remarkable reported claim that, quote, "it might be necessary for young men to know such things," registers to me as an astoundingly modern claim for a right to know about sex, about their own and especially about female bodies, bodily functions, sexual conduct, sexual and reproductive anatomy, and all else. All these uses of know probably resonated to some degree with what we usually refer of as the biblical sense of know, where it's a euphemism for having sexual contact with someone. For example, famously in Genesis 4:1, "And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord." But even though it may have resonated with the biblical sense of know, it's remarkable to me that all of the young men's attributed usages of know have an entirely secular sense to them. Edwards's recording and reproduction of their collective framing of the episode in epistemological terms, they were framing it in epistemological terms, also seems remarkable to me. And especially his recording of Ebenezer Bartlett's "It Might Be Necessary for Young Men to Know Such Things" seems to me a valuable, if inadvertent and apparently unnoticed by Edwards, specification of a young man's assertion of the legitimacy of book-learned sexual knowledge. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. My colleague Nan Wolverton is in the back with a mic. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Nan will bring the mic to you. For those who are watching on YouTube, my colleague Lauren Havelis is in the back and can forward your questions to the group as well.
Greta.
I'm going to start it if that's all right. Oh, thank you. Sorry, you just told us to use the mic. Here we are. Thanks so much for this talk. It's really interesting, and my mind is alight with all these different possibilities. But I wanted to ask, and this is a real throwing spaghetti at the wall question. But I want to something I noticed that I had not noticed until you put it on the screen was the apposition of imagination and heart. What was the phrase again?
They do it in their imagination, they do it in their heart.
They do it in their imagination, they do it in their heart. So I almost wonder if what I'm suggesting might add a thread to this genealogy that you're tracing of the sort of like emergence of this kind of like more singular vision of an internalized vision of what of sexuality, or the discourse that would come to be called sexuality. So the heart, I can't think about Edwards and not think about heart religion. Yeah. And one of the things that, and I'm gonna parrot a very flat version. I'm not an American religion scholar or history religion scholar, but I'm in a working group with someone who is, and shout out to Wendy Roberts on this point. But one of the things that I've sort of come to appreciate in reading her work over the years is thinking about the way that heart religion does have this more individuated sense of grace, right? Like it's not just that you're sort of, that you have a sort of predestined sort of status of your soul. It's not that your experience of grace is something that really only comes to be when it's sort of recognized by your community. It's like a one-to-one relationship. And I was, and to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because again, not a religion scholar, Edwards was one of the sort of believers on this front. And I'm curious whether you think that has a role to play alongside this sort of call to imagination, but the sort of heart of it, and whether you think Edwards might have been seeing this kind of form of desire or venery or like sexualized imagination as a sort of inroads to a kind of individual experience of desire, an understanding of an individualized experience of desire that might look like something like proto sexuality in the Foucauldian sense. So does that make sense as a question?
It makes total sense as a question. And it's something that I've actually just begun thinking about as I was working on this paper. That even some of the other language that's in Aristotle's masterpiece, like inclination, is a very Edwardsian word. And so on my coffee table at home, I have Edwards's The Religious Affections waiting to be reread after many, many years, and The Freedom of the Will, also waiting to be reread after many, many years, so that I can understand better how his religious terms or discourses might have been coloring the way he looked at this episode. So I don't have any firm idea about that yet, just it's part of the agenda for this inquiry, and I'm not a scholar of religion either, so I'm going to do my best. But if anybody here has good advice for me on that score, I'd be really grateful. But yeah, there's definitely something there.
We have a question from our virtual audience.
Okay.
Hello from a former grad student at U of C in the mid-'80s. Really interesting, Chris. Thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if anyone has pondered a meaning of the titular masterpiece, possibly a pun on the penis?
Yeah, definitely. It's the book is full of puns and full of wordplay and so forth. So absolutely, that's true. You're not going to tell me who the former graduate student is?
William de Giancarlo. Giacomatione.
Oh. William.
So sorry, William.
No, that's okay. William Di Giacomontonio, who was a graduate student in a class of mine at the University of Chicago many, many years ago. And he's since become a distinguished historian himself. So thank you, Will. No, it's a wild and wacky book with all kinds of, I gave you a few tastes of some of the stranger dimensions of it, but hi, Chip.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. That was lovely. I'd love to know more about the book itself or the various editions of it. How big was it? Maybe what we can trace about how it circulated, not to sound like a size queen, but just thinking about, is this a book that people are hiding undercover, a book that people would be proud to own? Like just thinking about the materiality of the text itself and thinking about the book, what we know of this edition that Edwards might have encountered.
Yeah, well, one of the frustrations is we don't know exactly what edition or editions were circulating. But those of you who were here at the seminar earlier today, there was a whole table over there with multiple editions of Aristotle's masterpiece, and they're generally speaking small. And one of the many things that I want to think more about is that Edwards, in his two sets of notes, when he's taking testimony especially, one of the young men hid the book between the lining and the exterior of his coat. Another one seems to have hidden it behind his bed. Another one was hidden in the press behind the chimney. So I want to think more about the material circulation of this book in public and private spaces in Northampton in 1740. Well, it actually started years before 1744, but culminated in 1744. So does that answer your question? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you, Chris. This was really
hi, Sarah.
wonderful. I found that beautiful and interesting in many ways, and also deeply disturbing. I mean, not you, but like because like you said it, you don't think it's incipient foreplay. Agree. And I'm going to use a very modern term right now, but like part of what I heard in the story you were telling was what I would call sort of like incipient rape culture, actually, both in terms of the sort of wink, wink, boys be being boys, but also in the way that it's women's development that incites all of these kinds of dangers for women, and I think you talked really nicely about this in terms of like. Women are being asked to regulate themselves so that men can be regulated in whatever minimal way that they are regulatable in the logic of what you're describing, which is what I found disturbing about it, because part of what it suggests, if we're telling a proto history of understandings of sexuality, is that sexuality is deeply rooted in not just sort of violence in the ways we talked about it in the seminar in some context, but like specific kinds of embodied violence that are oriented towards gender difference, right?
Yeah.
And so the question I want to ask, to be less disturbed, is what are some ways that you are thinking about how this early history of what we might recognize as sexuality, how seeing that trajectory might help us see different things about sexuality as a social formation that circulates among people? Like, I don't want to say like, say something liberatory, please, about the history of sexuality, but like, how does this proto history help us see differently what we have inherited in a way that might help us understand each other as sort of beings in a sexual social ecosystem? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, that makes great sense as a question, and it's a really hard question, and thank you for it. I mean, I hope this was implicit in my whole talk, but if this is part of the genealogy of sexuality, it's specifically part of the genealogy of heterosexuality and patriarchy and their relationship to one another. So one thing this might arguably reveal is that rape culture or patriarchal domination is sort of baked into sexuality as such at its very origin, baked into heterosexuality as such at its very origin. That's just a very rough thought about it, but thank you for pushing me there. Thank you for letting me ask it. No, of course, of course.
I'd like to sneak in one final question from our virtual audience. Eva Chamberlain says, thank you for your close reading of my essay. On Edwards's views of the imagination, there is another transition, but with imagination as opening for the devil and the creative imagination. Do you have thoughts on this?
Say that again. Imagination.
There is another transition with imagination as opening for the devil and the creative imagination.
Okay. That again seems really on the money and really right. I don't have any thoughts about it quite yet. But thank you, Eva Chamberlain, for listening to me and giving me a new part of my agenda. Okay.
I want to say thank you to Chris Looby for this engrossing talk. Thank you. A really engrossing and multi-layered talk. I know that folks in the room may have more questions, which we'd be delighted to have you continue talking with Chris about across the street, where we have a reception to honor Chris and to welcome all of you to join us for the reception, talk with one another, and continue the conversation about this marvelous Wiggins lecture. I wanted to mention one or two things. One thing coming up, that is our next program, which is next Tuesday night here at AAS, also virtual. This is in celebration of Juneteenth next week. Multimedia artist Jasmine Lee Johnson will be in conversation with Debbie Hall, who is AAS counselor and founder of the Worcester Black History Project, about Lee Johnson's textile installation, Not Nevermore, which was based in part on her research here as a J. and Deborah Last Fellow. That's next Tuesday night at 7 p.m. in person and live streaming. As always, all of our programs, including the one we've just heard, become available on our YouTube channel. Please recommend them to your friends, bring them to your students, spread the word. And we are delighted that you were here tonight. Thank you so much to everybody in the room and on live streaming. And thank you so much, Chris Looby.
Thank you.